The first recorded ferry service between Staten Island and Manhattan began in 1817, but people had been crossing the water long before that date. It was established by the Richmond Turnpike Company using the steamboat Nautilus and introduced by Daniel D. Tompkins, making scheduled trips from Staten Island's Quarantine area, later St. George, to Whitehall in Manhattan, replacing older, slower sailboat ferries. It opens a window into a time when the harbor felt wide, harsh, and full of questions. It also hints at how something ordinary, such as a short ride across a channel, grew into a lifeline that shaped the future of two shores. The early story begins in the 1600s when the Dutch settled New Amsterdam. Back then, the harbor had no formal ferry schedule. Small wooden boats handled crossings when weather allowed. These trips were slow and uncertain. The water could turn rough without warning. The currents pulled against the oars. People crossed because they had no choice. They needed supplies. They needed trade. Some wanted to reach churches or courts in Manhattan. Some needed to escape the quiet isolation on Staten Island. Every crossing carried a hint of tension. A wrong turn could push the small craft far from land. This setting builds the first reason to care. Travels shaped community. The island felt far away, yet close enough to imagine connection. The early settlers lived with this conflict: stay on the island and accept its stillness, or cross the water and face the harbor's mood. By the early 1700s, these trips became more important. Staten Island farms grew grain, fruit, and livestock. Workers needed to bring goods to Manhattan. Small businesses needed to move supplies back. Yet the crossing had no order. A person might wait hours for a boat. The harbor governed everything. This period reveals the slow birth of a theme that will run through the entire history of the Staten Island Ferry. The need for the trip stayed constant. The challenge never stopped shifting. As more settlers arrived, pressure to improve the crossing grew. Records from the early 1700s mention private boatmen who charged whatever they wanted. Their boats were small and wore down fast. Safety depended on the skill of the person rowing. There were no docks designed for large groups. There were no clear laws about price. Travelers complained. Merchants argued. Some historians note frustration between the private boat operators and the wider community. It was not yet a system, it was survival. The next turning point came in the late colonial period. The British controlled the region. Troops needed to move between the two shores. Supplies needed to move too. The crossing took on political meaning. Control of the water meant control of movement. It shaped decisions during the American Revolution as well. Staten Island became a base for British forces. Manhattan became a target. The short distance between them helped the British coordinate rapid moves during the conflict. The same water that traders feared became a military tool. This period adds tension to the early story of the ferry. The crossing was not only about trade now, it was about power. It was about the struggle to hold territory. It forced the early settlers to see the harbor through a different lens. The water connected the shores, but it also exposed them. After the revolution ended, the region began rebuilding. The country was new. Trade restarted. Staten Island residents hoped for a stable path forward. They needed dependable access to Manhattan. This need grew stronger as the island's population rose. More families farmed the land, more children were born, more goods needed transport. Yet the crossing remained disorderly. In the early 1800s, a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt entered the story. At this time, he was only a teenager from a modest background, but his skill on the water stood out. He began operating a small boat service in New York Harbor. His work included carrying passengers from Staten Island. He rode through rough waves to deliver people and goods. Some early accounts mention his strong work ethic. Some speak of his sharp understanding of opportunity. He noticed the weak links in the harbor's transportation. He saw demand. He saw the gaps. This part of the history introduces a new force into the narrative: competition. The harbor's crossings were no longer handled by small, scattered operators alone. Ambitious young men entered the field with speed and confidence. Vanderbilt's early success reveals a shift in the social tone of the ferry story. More people cared about efficiency. More people wanted the crossing to run on clear schedules. Growth pressure mounted. Still, the system remained fragmented. The boats were different from one another. Some used sails, some used oars. Some were built for goods, some carried only people. Storms stopped service at random. Passengers had no idea when the next boat might arrive. Complaints reached local leaders. The tension continued to rise. The year 1817 marks the official start of organized service. This happened when the Richmond Turnpike Company introduced a steam-powered ferry between Staten Island and Manhattan. The company was formed by Daniel D. Tompkins, who was then governor of New York. He believed that better transport would bring growth to Staten Island. The launch of the steam ferry was part of his larger plan to improve travel and raise the value of the land his company managed. This decision changed the next century of movement across the harbor. Steam power had already begun to prove itself on American waters. Robert Fulton had launched the North River Steamboat in 1807, and people saw how steam engines could push boats through tides with steady force. The Richmond Turnpike Company took this idea and applied it to the Staten Island route. The results were clear. Boats could fight currents with confidence. They no longer depended on sails or oars. Trips became more predictable, and this reliability pulled new attention toward Staten Island. The first major ferry of this new system was called the Richmond. It was a steam-propelled vessel designed to serve the new line. The Richmond traveled between Staten Island's northern shore and Whitehall Street in Manhattan. This route would become the main path for the ferry for generations. For the first time in the island's history, travelers could trust that a boat would be there at a set time. People wrote about how this changed daily life. Workers could plan. Families could move with less fear. Merchants gained better access to the city. Before steam power, crossings could take a long time. They could fail due to wind, cold, storms, or tide. Some days, no one could cross. When steam arrived, those barriers weakened. Trips became shorter and more stable. This shift felt huge to residents who remembered long waits at the shore. Many saw the new service as a step toward a safer future. The introduction of steam power feels like a climax to this part of the story. It solved a problem that had caused hardship for more than 100 years. Steam engines reduced the risk of delays. They made it easier to travel in winter. They allowed ferries to keep steadier schedules. Passengers felt safer, though steam engines were still new to many. The change gave the island a sense of comfort and confidence it had never known before. But the story does not end here. Steam technology brought new tensions. The engines needed skilled workers. They needed fuel. They needed maintenance that cost money each month. The Richmond Turnpike Company wanted profits, and this pushed them to control pricing. Some people said the fares were too high. Others complained that the company held too much power over such an important route. These concerns appeared in public meetings and letters of that time. Steam engines also carried risks. Fires were a real danger in early steamboats. The boilers produced heat and pressure that had to be managed with care. While the Richmond did not face a major disaster in its early years, many Americans knew stories of other steamboats that suffered accidents. This made some passengers uneasy. They trusted the new system, but they also remembered the dangers that came with steam travel across the country. Still, the mood in 1817 was full of hope. Many people felt that this was a new beginning for Staten Island. The harbor seemed smaller. The distance between the island and Manhattan felt shorter. Each crossing showed people that the island did not have to remain rural and distant. Growth felt possible. Families could imagine new futures. Workers could think about jobs in the city without fear of the long trip. The rise of organized ferry service also reshaped Staten Island's early identity. It gave the island a stronger connection to New York's life and economy. Staten Island was not yet part of the city and government, but many felt it had joined New York in daily experience. The sound of the ferry's whistles spread through the area. It told people the day was moving. It told them that travel was steady. Many later said the ferry became a part of their routine. It gave a sense of structure to life. The earliest passengers carried mixed emotions. Some felt excitement when they stepped onto the deck. Others feared the sounds of the engines. Many adults remembered older crossings in small boats, and they compared those memories with the new steam-powered ride. Some felt nervous around the machinery. Some felt relief. Some felt proud that their home had a system equal to other growing ports. All felt that something important was changing. Travelers said the new ferry made the world feel more reachable. It reduced the sense of isolation that had shaped Staten Island's early years. Each trip gave proof that progress was possible. Each departure and arrival built trust. Step by step, the ferry helped shape the path toward a modern connection that would guide the island for the rest of the century. Yet success brought conflict. Many small, independent boatmen who once controlled the crossing lost customers. They complained about the company's influence. Some said the prices did not feel fair. Others said the company had too much control. The harbor became a scene of rivalry. Some private operators tried to keep their customers. Some lowered prices. Some offered services at unusual hours. The tension grew, and with it came pressure on the Richmond Turnpike Company. By the 1820s, ferry travel had become a daily routine for many people. Workers used it, merchants used it, families used it. Staten Island was not yet part of New York City. It stood separate, but the ferry made the island feel closer to Manhattan than it had ever felt before. A steady pattern formed in the harbor. A ferry left Staten Island, it arrived in Manhattan, it returned, and it carried stories on each trip, stories of people who moved with purpose, fear, hope, and uncertainty. The growth of the ferry line also shaped Vanderbilt's career. He saved money, studied business, and learned the harbor's economic landscape. His time at the ferry taught him how transportation shaped power. It taught him how to read demand. It taught him how to think beyond the day's work. Soon he expanded into steamboat operations of his own. Although he eventually grew beyond Staten Island, the early ferry years remained an important part of his rise. This adds a layer of historical significance to the Staten Island Ferry. It was not only a public need, it was a launchpad for one of America's most influential businessmen. As steam technology improved, the Richmond Turnpike Company introduced more vessels. Among them was the Nautilus, which added capacity and reduced delays. These boats were stronger and faster than earlier ones. But stronger boats carried more people, and more people meant more risks. Harbors at the time lacked the strict safety laws that later decades would adopt. Boilers needed careful handling. Fires could start without warning. Collisions could happen in fog. Every trip rested on the crew's skill. The 1820s and 1830s brought another challenge, the rise of Manhattan. As the city expanded northward, the waterfront changed. More ships filled the harbor. More cargo moved through the piers. Ferry captains had to navigate through busy channels. A crowded harbor created confusion. Horns, shouts, and rapid turns formed the atmosphere of daily operations. Passengers trusted the crew to handle the chaos. Many never knew how narrow the margins were. During this period, the ferry also shaped Staten Island in unexpected ways. New businesses opened near the landing points. Inns, taverns, and small stores appeared to serve travelers. Roads improved. Carriages carried passengers further inland. The island grew slowly, but its future direction was clear. The ferry made the island valuable. Still, tension never faded. The Richmond Turnpike Company struggled with money. Repairs cost more than expected. Dock maintenance drained land resources. Seasonal weather damaged the wooden structures. The company needed constant cash to stay alive. Fares helped, but not enough to build a financial cushion. These strains weakened the company over time. Another issue grew quietly in the background. Steam travel created pollution. Coal smoke drifted through the air. Ash settled on decks and clothing. Passengers complained, but they still used the ferry because it remained the fastest path to Manhattan. The complaints show an early example of a theme that would repeat throughout ferry history: comfort versus necessity. One of the biggest turning points came in the 1830s when pitching and competition escalated. Other operators tried to enter the ferry market. Some used small steam vessels, others used sailboats. They could not match the turnpike company's power, but they added stress to the business environment. With each new competitor, prices shifted. Passengers watched the tension unfold. Some supported the company, some supported independent captains. The harbor became a theater of ambition. In the same decade, larger social events influenced the ferry's history. The country faced economic trouble. The Panic of 1837 shook businesses across the nation. Money dried up. Companies struggled. The Richmond Turnpike Company suffered too. During this time, the company sold some of its assets. It struggled to repair vessels. Delays increased. Complaints spread among daily commuters. Yet the ferry still ran. This reveals the strength of demand. People depended on these boats. The company knew this. The community knew this. The city knew this. The ferry could weaken, but it could not vanish. It held too much importance. By the 1840s, steam technology improved again. Newer boats entered service. They used stronger engines. They could handle rough weather better. Yet each improvement brought new questions. How much should be invested? How fast should boats be built? Who should control the line? These questions shaped debates in Staten Island households and Manhattan offices. A lesser-known challenge from this time involved the docks themselves. Early docks had simple designs. They shifted in storms. They broke under heavy weight. They cracked under winter ice. Workers spent long hours repairing them. Some bridges needed full replacement. Each failure delayed service. Each repair stretched budgets. The public rarely saw these struggles, but they shaped the ferry's future. Another quiet struggle involved crew labor. Working on a steam ferry demanded long hours. It required careful handling of engines. It exposed workers to heat, smoke, and stress. Pay varied. Conditions depended on the owners. This era carried no strong worker protections. Crew members formed a hidden backbone that kept the ferry running. Without them, the boats would fail. Their daily battles deserve recognition as part of the ferry's story. The 1840s also delivered moments of danger. Records speak of fires on various steam vessels across the region. Boilers burst on some boats. Flames spread fast. Even when tragedies occurred on other lines, passengers felt fear. They wondered if their ferry would be next. These worries shaped the public mood. Yet, the Staten Island ferry line managed to avoid major early disasters. Skill, luck, and constant attention kept the boats moving. As the 1850s approached, pressure for stronger regulations grew. City officials watched the rising number of passengers. They recognized the importance of safe transport. Discussions began about greater oversight. These early talks did not produce sweeping changes, but they set the stage for later reforms. They also show how the ferry's growth forced New York to rethink public safety. Another major turning point came with the expansion of Staten Island communities. More people settled near St. George. More homes appeared near the old landing points. Growth created more demand for travel. This placed a new strain on the ferry line. Boats needed to run more trips. Crews needed to work more shifts. The company struggled with these demands. By the mid-1800s, the Richmond Turnpike Company's grip weakened. The financial strain, competition, and rising costs led to the end of its influence. New owners and new companies stepped in. The ferry passed into new hands with new ideas. Some promised better schedules. Some promised better boats. Some promised more comfort. Whether these promises were met varied by year. What mattered was that the ferry lived on. The island still needed the crossing. The city still needed the link. By the early 1850s, the Staten Island ferry entered a new phase. The boats were stronger, the crowds grew larger, the harbor grew busier. Yet this period carried more danger than the public could see. Steam power, though trusted, still had limits. The city was not yet ready for the safety rules of later times. This tension shaped the years ahead. New companies controlled the ferry through parts of this era. One key figure was Daniel Drew, a businessman who played a wide role in steamboat history. His interests stretched beyond the Staten Island route, but his control helped shape ferry decisions during the 1850s. Under new ownership, the service expanded. More boats ran at more times, more workers joined the crews, and with more movement came more risk. The harbor itself changed. New York City grew fast. Ships from many nations filled the waterfront. Sailboats mixed with steamships. Cargo vessels lined the piers. Tugboats pushed barges through tight paths. Every vessel created noise and motion. Ferry captains had to read this chaos with care. One mistake could cause disaster. During this time, fires on steam vessels across the region sparked fear. The public followed these incidents through newspapers. Flames could rise from wood decks, boilers could fail, smoke could spread fast. Passengers felt trapped when flames appeared at sea. While the Staten Island ferry tried to avoid such events, the fear never disappeared. Staten Island grew too. Settlements expanded near the ferry landings. More residents worked in Manhattan. Each new home meant another person who needed the crossing. This population growth created pressure for more schedules, stronger boats, and tighter operations. The ferry line could not afford delays. By the 1860s, the Civil War changed the nation. New York Harbor became a site of troop movements and war preparation. Ships carrying supplies passed daily. The ferry continued to operate, but the atmosphere felt different. The nation was divided. The harbor carried signs of conflict. Crowds in both Staten Island and Manhattan felt the stress of the times. Soldiers passed through the ferry terminals as they moved to other posts. Families traveled to the city for news. The ferry became a quiet witness to the worries of the era. During the war period, the ferry companies struggled at times. Fuel costs rose, repairs grew more expensive, labor demands increased. Yet boats still ran. The public needed the service. Crews worked long hours to keep each engine stable. After the Civil War ended, the city returned to rapid growth. The 1870s and 1880s transformed New York into a larger, more complex urban center. Roads changed, immigration grew, factories expanded. The ferry faced larger crowds than ever. It also faced more challenges. One issue was the quality of the boats. Some older steam ferries had worn frames, some needed upgrades. But upgrades cost money, and owners made decisions based on profit, not public comfort. Newspapers through the era featured complaints about delays, breakdowns, and crowded decks. Some passengers wrote letters to editors. Some told stories of rough crossings. These voices show the public's rising concern. A lesser-known problem from this era involved winter ice. When the harbor froze, ferries struggled. Ice slowed the boats. It damaged paddle wheels. It pushed vessels off course. Crews sometimes used poles to break ice near landings. The public rarely knew how hard this work was. They only saw the cold. They did not see the stress that ice placed on each trip. Another challenge involved boiler maintenance. Steam engines needed careful care. A weak boiler could burst. This danger was known in many American waterways. Several tragic steamboat accidents around the country placed pressure on ferry owners to invest in safer designs. Some listened, some delayed. This conflict between progress and cost shaped the mood of the 1870s. The harbor also remained crowded. Ferry captains moved between large ships and narrow gaps. Fog added new danger. Thick fog could make the harbor vanish. Captains could not see far ahead. Bells and whistles became guides. Passengers listened in fear during foggy trips. They trusted the crew, but the tension remained strong. Then came one of the worst moments in the ferry's history, a moment that would reshape everything. On June 14, 1971, the ferry boat Westfield exploded at its Manhattan landing. The blast came from the boiler. Many passengers were boarding at the time. The explosion tore through the vessel. The force shook the surrounding pier. People nearby rushed to help. The scene was chaotic, painful, and unforgettable. The tragedy caused many deaths and injuries. It remains one of the darkest days in Staten Island ferry history. The Westfield disaster marked a turning point. The public demanded answers. Newspapers published detailed reports. Officials investigated the cause. The pressure grew for reform. Many asked why the boiler failed. Many questioned the management. Many asked why safety rules were weak. Investigations pointed to mechanical problems and poor maintenance. The findings showed the need for stronger oversight. The tragedy forced the city and ferry operators to rethink their approach to safety. The reforms that followed did not erase the pain of the day, but they created change. Better inspections emerged. Stronger rules for boiler handling grew. Ferry owners faced higher expectations. This tragedy also shaped public memory. Families mourned. Communities discussed the event for years. For Staten Island residents, the Westfield explosion became a reminder of how fragile travel could be. Every routine trip carried risk, and in that risk lived a deep emotional connection to the ferry's story. In the years after 1871, the ferry line worked to rebuild trust. New boats entered service. The design of some ferries improved. Crews trained with greater care. Yet the company still struggled at times. Money issues continued, delays appeared. Public frustration rose again during the late 1800s. One important shift came when the city of New York sought more influence over ferries. Staten Island was still separate from New York City, but the city recognized the ferry as a vital link. Discussions about public control began to appear. Some argued that the ferry should become a city-run service. Others felt private operators could still manage it. During this era, terminal structures also improved. The Manhattan landing saw repairs. Staten Island docks changed too. The hope was to reduce accidents and improve boarding. Better ramps, stronger timbers, and more organized layouts helped. Yet, problems still occurred. Crowds sometimes surged. Weather damaged structures. Fires at nearby piers created new threats. The 1880s brought more growth. Staten Island communities expanded further. As small towns spread along the island, reliance on the ferry deepened. Each new neighborhood meant more commuters. Each commuter meant new pressure on the ferry line. Schedules grew crowded. Some trips ran late. Some boats needed repair faster than expected. Another lesser-known issue of this era involved freight. Some ferries carried small amounts of goods. Barrels, crates, and luggage filled corners of the deck. This mixed-use system added complexity to operations. Workers needed to secure items during rough water. Loose cargo could cause injury. Over time, the ferry line tried to reduce these risks by changing loading methods. Fog again and again created trouble. Reports from the 1880s and 1890s describe ferries stopping mid-harbor when visibility dropped. Passengers waited in silence. The engines idled. Bells rang in the distance. Crews listened for other vessels. These quiet moments carried deep tension. People on board knew how fragile the situation was. By the 1890s, a new shift began. Urban development pushed faster. The city pressed for better transit links. Pressure increased for a modern ferry system. Some boat designs improved. Steel frames began to replace older wood designs in many vessels across the region. Stronger hulls helped reduce fire risk. Yet full modernization remained slow. Money problems and conflicting interests stalled progress. Another important development came near the end of the century. In 1898, the five boroughs, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, were consolidated into the city of New York. This event changed everything for the ferry. Staten Island was no longer separate. It became part of the city structure, and with this shift came larger plans for public ferry oversight. One question remained that shaped the 1890s. Should the ferry become a public service controlled by the city? Many felt that private ownership failed to protect passengers. The tragedies, delays, and breakdowns showed the limits of profit-driven management. Public ownership promised stability, safety, and long-term planning. The debate shaped the last years of the century. Meetings were held, reports were written, residents voiced opinions, journalists described the issues. The tension grew as the century neared its end. At the start of the 1900s, the Staten Island ferry reached a turning point that many residents had hoped for. The city began to move toward full public control. This shift came after years of complaints, tragedies, and pressure for reform. People wanted safety. They wanted stable schedules. They wanted a service that cared about them. They wanted change, and the new century held the promise of that change. The consolidation of the five boroughs in 1898 set this plan in motion. Staten Island was now part of New York City. The ferry was no longer a simple route run by private companies. It became a link between two parts of one city. This status raised expectations. City officials knew the public demanded action. They also understood the risks of delay. By 1905, New York City took full control of the Staten Island ferry. This was a major event. The city now carried the responsibility of all operations. This shift marked the end of decades of private ownership. Many residents believed this was the start of a safer and more reliable era. Yet the city also inherited every problem the ferry system had carried for years: aging boats, crowded docks, and strict safety needs. One of the city's first tasks was to modernize the fleet. Steel-hulled boats were now replacing older wooden vessels across the nation. Steel offered far better fire protection. It reduced the risk of structural failure. It held steady in rough water. City engineers recognized this advantage. The plan to build new steel ferries began. In 1905, the city introduced two new vessels, the Manhattan and the Brooklyn. Their steel frames made them safer than many earlier boats. Their design included improved passenger areas, stronger decks, and better engine systems. These vessels marked the beginning of what many called the modern ferry era. Crowds welcomed them. The boats looked stronger. They felt steady under the feet of passengers. The Staten Island terminals also needed work. The city committed to new infrastructure. The Manhattan terminal at South Ferry saw upgrades. Staten Island's St. George terminal began a transformation. Engineers worked to replace older wood piers with stronger structures. They improved loading areas. They created a more organized flow for passengers. This work took time, but each change helped build a safer system. During the early 1900s, immigration surged across New York Harbor. Ships from Europe arrived daily. Passengers from many nations passed through the harbor. The ferry crossed these waters every day. It moved through a region full of hope, struggle, and heavy traffic. Captains worked with constant focus. They navigated around steamships, freighters, and tugboats. Each day brought new risks. Weather still challenged operations. Fog in the harbor created tension. Winter ice pressed against hulls. High winds shook the water. But the new steel boats handled these conditions better. Passenger trust began to rise again. Yet trust was fragile, and the ferry would soon face one of its greatest tests. On June 30, 1901, before city ownership began, a major tragedy struck the harbor. The excursion steamer General Slocum caught fire in the East River, causing massive loss of life. While this was not a Staten Island ferry boat, the event shook the entire city and forced new attention to marine safety. After the Slocum disaster, officials and engineers increased their pressure on all marine services, including the Staten Island Ferry. The event served as a national warning. The ferry needed stronger safety systems. Fire drills, equipment checks, and evacuation procedures gained importance. By the 1910s, the Staten Island Ferry gained new vessels. The Richmond, Castleton, and Tompkinsville joined the fleet. Their steel design improved safety. They carried more passengers. They offered more reliable engines. These vessels helped the city meet the demands of a growing commuter population. Staten Island's communities expanded fast. New homes, businesses, and roads appeared along the North Shore. More people needed to reach Manhattan for work. With growth came pressure on the terminals. The old terminals struggled with heavy crowds. Repairs were constant. Weather damage forced frequent maintenance. Fires at nearby piers always threatened operations. Each new challenge tested the city's ability to keep the system running. In 1914, the First World War began in Europe. Although the United States did not enter until 1917, the war changed the feel of the harbor. Ships carrying supplies moved through the water. Troop transport vessels lined the docks. The ferry carried soldiers, workers, and families who needed to travel. The atmosphere was tense at times. Many passengers thought about the war during their daily crossings. The ferry continued to operate through the war years. Crews worked long shifts. They checked engines with greater care. The city pushed for stronger safety rules. Many feared any event that could place civilians or soldiers in danger during wartime. The ferry remained steady, but the pressure was clear. After the war, the 1920s brought new growth. New York City expanded at a fast pace. Roads changed, buildings rose, crowds grew larger. Staten Island saw more development near the ferry routes. The city needed even larger ferries to meet the demand. It was during this time that the idea for a new class of vessels began to form. But the decade also brought new challenges. Fires along the waterfront remained common. Warehouses caught fire. Piers burned. The ferry had to navigate past smoke-filled air. Flames near terminals forced rerouting. Each event reminded the city that danger lived close to the daily routine. In 1926, the city introduced the Dongan Hills and Knickerbocker ferries. They represented a stronger design with better equipment. Their steel bodies held firm in storm conditions. They also provided more comfortable space for passengers. These ferries were a sign that the city understood the need for constant improvement. Still, the terminals remained a weak point. The St. George terminal in particular needed major upgrades. Crowds were growing faster than the building could support. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the structure stable. Winter storms damaged the piers. Waves struck the wooden piles. Engineers knew a larger project would be needed soon. Another lesser-known issue of this era was the handling of cars. Before bridges connected the boroughs, some ferries allowed automobiles on board. The process was not simple. Workers had to guide each car onto the deck. Sloping ramps created risks. Cars were secured with care, but many passengers found the process tense. The mix of pedestrians and vehicles raised safety concerns. The city continued to study improvements. Then came a moment that shook the entire system. On June 25, 1930, a fire broke out at the St. George Terminal in Staten Island. The blaze moved fast. Flames spread through the wooden sections of the building. Several older ferry boats nearby were destroyed. The fire caused loss of life. It shocked the city. The scale of the fire forced the city to act. The terminal was rebuilt with stronger materials. Concrete and steel replaced old wooden structures. Fire-resistant designs became the new standard. The city recognized that past methods could no longer support the future. The rebuilt terminal stood as a sign of progress born from tragedy. During the 1930s, the Great Depression struck the country. Families faced hardship. Jobs were lost. Businesses closed. Yet the ferry kept running. The city saw it as essential. People needed affordable travel. The fare stayed low. The ferry gave workers a way to reach jobs in Manhattan. It also gave families a way to move through the city when money was scarce. At the same time, new vessels entered planning and construction. Engineers studied better engines. They tested new hull designs. They explored improved navigation systems. The ferry would soon enter a newer era, one shaped by stronger engineering and more refined safety laws. Could the ferry rise from tragedy toward a safer future? The early 1900s tested the ferry again and again. Fires, crowds, war, growth. Each event taught the city something new. Each event pushed the ferry toward improvement. The turning points forged a system that no longer relied on old wooden frames or unpredictable engines. The age of steel became the foundation of the next era. A city is a collection of people and stories, yet the boats that moved across the harbor carried some of the quietest stories of all. By the time the 19th century reached its later years, the Staten Island ferry was no longer a set of small boats trying to survive wind and waves. It had become a service that people depended on for work, family, and connection. What once began with a single boat guided by a single man now stood as one of the most steady links between two growing parts of New York. But with that growth came new pressure. The city had questions to settle, fears to manage, and a duty to protect the service from failure. The push for a stronger system did not come from pride. It came from fear. Every decade brought its own challenges. Some were born from storms and tides. Some came from crowded boats and old engines. Others came from the city's need to show that it could run a large service with safety at its center. The ferry had already survived political disputes and business competition. Now it had to face the changing shape of the city itself. More workers were crossing the harbor each day. More homes were rising on Staten Island. More streets were opening across Lower Manhattan. Each new change placed weight on the same few boats that had carried people for many decades. As demand grew, the city understood that it needed to rebuild the system from the water up. This was not a simple task. A ferry service is more than boats. It needs trained crews, strong docks, honest planning, and steady funding. The city had stepped in before, but now the pressure was deeper. The people who rode the ferry saw it as a right, not a favor. The city had to protect that trust. It had to design a service that respected the past and prepared for what was coming. Officials debated schedules, vessel size, and fuel sources. They disagreed about budgets and safety rules. They argued about where to place new terminals. These debates were not small. They shaped the next stage of the ferry's story. One of the largest tensions came from the shift in technology. The earliest ferries ran on simple force, oars, sails, and the strength of the tide. Steam had changed everything in the 19th century, but steam also brought new risks. Engines could fail, boilers could break, fires could spread fast on wooden decks. The city knew it had to retire older boats, but replacing vessels was expensive. Placing old boats in service was dangerous. The city stood in the middle, trying to balance cost and safety. The public had no patience for slow decisions. Families boarded these boats each morning and night. Workers trusted the crews with their lives. It was not a simple responsibility. The rise of steel hulls offered an answer. Steel vessels were stronger, safer, and easier to maintain. They could carry more passengers without losing stability. They could handle rough weather better than the wooden boats that had served the harbor for generations. But steel came with a price. The city needed large investments to buy and build new vessels. Leaders had to convince taxpayers that the cost was worth it. Many agreed. Some argued against it. The debate reached newspaper pages and public meetings. Through all this noise, one fact stayed clear. The people of Staten Island knew that the ferry was not a luxury. It was the heart of their daily life. During this same period, a quiet but important shift was taking place. The ferry was becoming a symbol of identity. For some New Yorkers, the subway was the core of their day. For others, it was the streetcar or the elevated line. But for Staten Island, the ferry was more than transport. It was a daily crossing filled with views, familiar faces, and routines. People built friendships on these decks. They watched the skyline change through the years. They stood together during fog, rain, and cold. Children looked forward to the ride. Parents trusted the cruise. These shared moments held meaning. They created a quiet bond among riders who might not speak but shared the same journey.